The names of the podcasts have to be representative of what we are including in them, but also it cannot be too long just for avoiding clumsiness. So this should actually be the linkages between ecosystem-based adaptation and national adaptation plans, but I shortened it, as you can see. So here we talked about various stages of NAP processes where ecosystem-based adaptation has to be considered. So chapter 5 looks at the review stage in the NAP process. The important review stage focuses on the evaluation process and methods, implementation of participatory methods, identifying gaps, and demonstrating how effective reviews and lessons learned can lead into continuous updating and revision of the National Adaptation Plan. I've mentioned this several times. Adaptation sometimes is hard structures, like building seawalls for sea level adaptation, or building drainage systems, shelters, cyclone protections, etc. So you cannot really constantly update and revise the National Adaptation Plan, but it still has to be as strategically flexible as possible because the climate change risks themselves are evolving. So if you are planning for excess rainfall and then you begin to dry up, then what do you do? Or if you have planned for arid conditions in terms of adaptation plans and strategies, and then it begins to get heavy rains suddenly because of warming, then how do you update and revise your plans? So it's a very tricky business. Periodic revision of NAP targets should be part of the NAP process itself. The lack of a quantified global target for adaptation compared to mitigation should not impede national authorities from setting and updating quantified targets for EBA in the NAP process and tracking progress towards achieving those targets. So mitigation is fairly straightforward. We are always trying to reduce emissions to stay below 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C targets, and everybody has a clear goal in terms of reducing their emissions or emission rates in terms of energy intensity of the GDP, carbon intensity of the energy, and so on. Already this year reports are out that India has reduced its intensity of emission by 33% or so since I think 2009 or 1990, whatever the baseline. So there GDP is increasing, emissions in absolute values are increasing, but the unit of GDP is coming with less emissions now, lesser emissions now than before. So emission rate is important, but total emissions have to come down. So mitigation in that sense is clear as a global target, but adaptation is very local and regional, and it adds up to resilience in some sense, but mostly locally, and then globally it should add up to sustainability and resilience as well. Okay, so nonetheless, the AHE targets for biodiversity and their expected updating in 2021 may provide a guide. So I'm not going to go into that here, but there is very good reports out by IPBES on how to value nature, not just in terms of market goods, but also in terms of biodiversity protection, external benefits, co-benefits, and so on and so forth. Strengthen engagement in the NAP review process of ministries of finance and of planning along with local governments to influence the development vision and budget allocation process for EBA. You can extend this to say that ecosystems are not, restricted by national boundaries. There are forests that spread across multiple nations. There are glaciers that spread across continents and so on. So can we also extend the engagement in or at least develop NAPs and then link the NAPs for like Indian subcontinent, which is very closely tied by the monsoon dynamics, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and so on. Can they have linked NAP processes as well? The NAP should become a living document that's routinely revised and updated in a formulation stage as conditions change and as more information becomes available, and as mainstreaming is pursued with greater vigor in line with the principles of adaptive management. So adaptive management is that you make plans to manage resources like ecosystems, water resources, energy, etc., forests, whatever, and you learn by doing, and as climate risks evolve, climate impacts change, you respond to them by changing your adaptation strategies as well. Chapter 6, I think next is conclusion, so we will keep reading. Here, linkages and alignment. So EBA can be implemented through sectoral plans and adaptation strategies at all governance levels and scales, and through regular or innovative sources of funding. A standalone NAP is not the only pathway to implementing EBA. Okay, good. EBA, through its cross-cutting characteristics and ability to intertwine ecological, social, and economic dimensions, is a valuable approach to enhancement of local, national, and international strategies and plans, as well as NAPs. Okay, so cross-cutting characteristics and ability to intertwine ecological, social, and ecological dimensions makes it an integral part of everything you're trying to protect and value, where you, in some cases you have clear ways of defining value, in some cases you don't. So but if they're closely linked, then you can carry everything forward. The same amount of attention should be paid to these linkages and alignment as there is to formulation, implementation, and review of the NAP document. EBA is recognized as a cross-cutting policy instrument with the Rio Plus 20 action plan. So 1992 I think was the Rio, and then Plus 20 happened. So Rio Plus 20 action plan on adaptation, describing it as a planning tool for unifying all three Rio conventions: Convention on Biological Diversity, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and United Nations Conventions to combat desertification. Okay, EBA is acknowledged to be essential to achieving the sustainable development goals. So integrating EBA in the sustainable development policy processes at a national level is an important enabler for implementation at all other levels. Okay. Sector plans should be screened for climate change risks and identification of entry points for integrating climate change adaptation and ecosystem-based adaptation. So if you think of agriculture, energy, water, let's say health, transportation, these are sectors where you have climate change risks being projected from physical climate change to risks on health, water, food, and so on. And then you want to also integrate EBA across adaptation in each sector. So sectoral plans then should be screened for climate change risks and how they cascade into overall adaptation like NAP, and how EBA can fit into these. Mainstreaming, for example, we talked about using ecosystems to filter water to deal with adaptation plans for water resources. So that is an example of how sectoral adaptation plans to climate change risks can include EBA. Mainstreaming EBA involves vertical coordination, so national to subnational, all the way down to governance levels at villages or towns and so on, and horizontal coordination because of cross-sectoral linkages in adaptation responses. So there may be multiple ministries, so often they are split into forestry, oil and gas or energy, infrastructure, environment, and so on. So they can all have to be coordinating to make sure that EBA is an integral part of all sectors and ministries and so on. Mainstreaming EBA is challenging, however, because it involves a paradigm shift in the culture and practices of institutions which tend to work in silos. So it has both a political dimension and an information and analytical dimension. So Energy Ministry can stay very focused on energy issues and not worry about how the energy portfolio is affected by or affects, let's say, water and agriculture, and vice versa. So agriculture can focus very much only on agricultural issues, food production, without just assuming that water will always be available, energy will always be available, but all three have to work together in terms of climate risks in each sector and how those risks overlap and compound the risks together. Okay, should I read conclusions? Maybe, just because I won't read all of it, I'll include it here. So coming to conclusions, EBA focuses on reducing vulnerability and building resilience to the impacts of climate change through the use of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Chapter 1 illustrated the essential alignment between EBA and nationally determined contributions, as at least 104 NDCs have acknowledged that ecosystems and biodiversity are vulnerable to climate change, and 76 countries pointed to the conservation of ecosystems as an important motivation for adaptation planning. And there are other details I won't read. In chapter 2, we just looked at the key findings, focusing on ensuring a sufficient explanation of the value provided by ecosystems, ecosystem services, and EBA. And they have to be available and detailed. Okay, an important conclusion in chapter 2 is that ecosystems and ecosystem services are also under threat from climate change, so EBA must accommodate and adjust responses to a constantly changing adaptation setting. The overwhelming rationale for adopting EBA in all NAPs is because well-designed and implemented EBA approaches generate multiple co-benefits in addition to protection from climate change impacts, including improved biodiversity protection, enhanced water and food security, alternative livelihood opportunities, community health, and disaster risk reduction. If all these benefits are calculated, then EBA becomes a benefit multiplier and an essential community asset, adding to social and natural capital. So if multiple ministries are coordinating, then they all have to realize that when they coordinate, they are using EBA as a multiplier of benefits. Okay, chapters 3 and 5 add an EBA perspective to the NAP technical guidelines, and the conclusion is finally, while inclusion of EBA in NAPs is critically important, the EBA measures identified and prioritized in the NAP process need to go far beyond NAPs alone. Chapter 6 outlines how EBA can be mainstreamed into national development planning, local climate action plans, sector plans, and aligned with MEA action plans as well as SDG implementation plans. Okay, so just keep those things in mind. Monitoring, evaluation, adaptation action plans, and sustainable development goal implementation plans. So countries can be very, very focused on development, economic development, and make some choices that are not very good for EBA or even NAP. So how to carry these together and how to synergize them along with mitigation to help SDGs, that's not so obvious. So they have to get special attention. We'll come back and look at the recommendations and wrap up this one, and then I'll add just a tiny bit from Adapt Now report from the Global Commission on Adaptation. I have a separate set of podcasts on this in a bit more detail in the Climate Solutions course, so you can look at those. I'm not going to link those here. I'll leave this independent as a part of the course on adaptation itself. Okay, so let's come back and do that in the next podcast. Sorry, just wanted to clarify something here. I said MEA is monitoring and evaluating adaptation, which is not correct. I remember the acronyms and sometimes I just mix them up, or I don't remember them and don't mention them. The report obviously every report I'm recording as podcast has list of acronyms. MEA here is multilateral environmental agreements. Okay, so MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements, and SDGs, sustainable development goals. Okay, sorry about that.